delivered, right? And they were picked up, of course, by the bears. The bears played a really important role. You might think, bears pooping and stuff, what can that do, right? So the bear pooping around. But actually, cumulatively, it's just huge what those bears would do. And other animals, coyotes, they all come down and get the carcasses, right? Because those salmon die, right? Except the steelhead. The steelhead kind of get really weak, and then they recover and they go back out to the ocean. But all the other 6 Pacific salmonid species, I say salmonid, I don't know why, I think it's salmonid. They all die, right? When they hit their home stream, they find a nice gravel bed. The females fight for territory. They want the best gravel, right? Because they want the gravel that's the right size for their tail to scoop up, because they need to dig a nest in the bottom of the river, right, or the stream. And so the gravel has to be the right size that they can move, but it can't be too small either, because if it's too small, then the current will wash it away. And they also want to have their nest in a section of the stream where the current's flowing at the right rate. Because if the current's flowing too slowly, then their eggs, which are buried in the gravel, won't get enough oxygen, and they'll suffer, right? Or if the current's flowing too rapidly, then maybe their eggs will get washed away. So the females know, right, exactly where they want to live, and then they fight among each other to decide who gets the best spot. And meanwhile, the males are off over there fighting among each other to show off to the females that, hey, I'm the biggest, baddest, toughest dude, and you gotta, anyway. And after they spawn, the males will fight off. They'll try to. Sometimes they can't. But all these interlopers come in, sneaky little guys that couldn't find a date, right? Couldn't find a date, but they gotta do their thing. So the male, jacks are precocious males that have returned prematurely, right? Before their peers, like 1 or 2 years before their peers, and they're much smaller. But they're viable, they want to have babies too. So oftentimes the jack will come darting in right when the spawning pair have finished. In human terms, I guess we'd call it having sex, but it's very different, I guess. For one thing, salmon only have sex one time. Anyway, it's fascinating to think about all these things. But clearly, and this is a point that Rolston makes over and over again, an individual non-human animal, a species over the length of a long period of evolutionary time, and an ecosystem all have these autopoietic characteristics that lead a reasonable person to conclude that they have some kind of moral status. All right? Okay, and basically that's the strongest possible rights claim that you could make. What I think many really serious environmentalists, and spiritually inclined environmentalists, that's really what they're saying. That these guys just have rights. Ecological wholes just have rights. And if you take a long-term view, and if you educate yourself on how an ecosystem works, then you'll realize that they're autopoietic, they're self-organizing, self-generating, they're beautiful, they have integrity, and they have stability. And perhaps, that's enough to say that we ought to formulate our natural resource policies in a way that's consistent with preserving them and protecting them. And damn it, it doesn't matter whether 99 old folks' homes are going to have to get unplugged in 10 years because they're losing the power and their electricity rates are going to go up, and then grandma and grandpa are going to have to pay way too much for their stay at the old folks' home, right? You can imagine all kinds of scenarios where the ecocentrists, sorry man, that's not enough. You just have to accommodate somehow. But these values in these salmon have been there for 30 million years, and what we do to them matters as a result. Once we realize that, what we do to them matters. All right, so what the Leopold land, according to Collicutt, all right, perhaps according to this is too much like Norton's point of view too, really. Collicutt, sadly enough, ends up metaethically very similar to Norton, which would be dismaying to Collicutt, which should be, because he's taken pains. Those guys don't like each other very much. There's no love lost between Collicutt and Norton. They kind of squabble a lot. Philosophers make all these barbed little insults to each other, that if you don't really understand their debates, then you can't really notice them. But sometimes they can be pretty harsh with each other. And old Collicutt and Norton, I think, have been kind of harsh with each other. But they end up, because Collicutt needs human conferral, right? And Norton Norton's just a flat-out anthropocentric. Collicutt hasn't explained to us yet how he manages to defend his more than anthropocentric axiology. He just hasn't done it. That's why we've turned to Milstein, one reason. Okay? But anyway, this is review now, Collicutt's explanation of how an ecological whole comes to obtain rights, comes to become a rights holder. Okay, many ecological wholes are of such high importance to long-term human interests, a fact that we learn about from biology, ecology, geology, climate science, etc., so important to our long-term interests as a species that they should be thought of as rights holders. Once an entity such as an ecological whole comes to be recognized, and this is this bizarre move, this is why he thinks he can call himself a more than anthropocentrist. Once an entity such as an ecological whole comes to be recognized as a rights holder, it has rights in some of the same meaningful senses that humans have rights. Okay? At minimum, being a rights holder, I'll mark you excused. Thank you. Sure. Helen. Humans will always have more rights, but in many cases, ecosystem rights to integrity and stability, I got redundant, will override human interest in development of an ecosystem. Vital ecosystem, again, it comes down to vital ecosystem needs versus vital human needs. If vital human needs are truly at stake, and there really is no way around it, that these 99 old folks' homes are literally going to be unplugged, and all these poor people thrown out in the street, yes, okay, then let's keep the dam, all right? But we're never talking about vital human needs. We're talking about trivial crap, right? Like 10 cents cheaper coffee at Starbucks, or 10 cents cheaper gas, I mean, no vital human need is at stake with any of these dams. So, or much of what we do. At minimum, being a rights holder means having rights to due process. Okay, and I say remember, but you haven't read Christopher Stone yet. But that's one thing he points out, is that just legally speaking, being a rights holder means that you have access to some institution which can address whatever grievance you have, right, about your rights being violated. Anyway, all right, so that must denote some kind of a shift in the direction of my lecture, perhaps. I don't know. I put these pictures in here at strategic intervals. Sometimes not, but anyway. And there, see, this is the moment at which I would invite you to note the difference in how I have these quadrants organized. In our chart, the one that we're using for this term, these two are switched. Okay? So that's why you got your bizarre little holistic, your anthro category kind of goes like that, right? In our chart, the one that we're using. But in this old version, I guess I thought there are some advantages to organizing it this way, right? You have on this way, you have all your more than anthros on this side, right? In our way, the way we're using it, you have all your holists on this side. Anyway, but you can see how you have, and I even, this was the most recent digital version that I have, which was last term, and I did include a social contract. I added that in there just because I think it belongs. Nihilism, of course, belongs up there to the left of the ego. Anyway, you don't need to know all that stuff. All right. But as I say, there's an outstanding offer for extra credit points. Anybody who wants to update this chart in the form that it currently enjoys in this form. Anyway, you can take the normative traditions, and it's all still there, all those elements. So I haven't identified them. Yeah, see, in those days I was still, just recently, I was talking about the Rolstonian ecocentrist versus the Leopoldian ecocentrist. And notice how the environmental virtue ethicists are right in between, right, up here. But nowadays I'm just calling these guys the Neo-Humean ecocentrists, right, and I'm calling the Rolstonians, I'm calling them the Neo-Kantian ecocentrists. Anyway. But there's an outstanding offer. But please note that the extra credit only goes toward your reading summaries. Okay? So don't think that you can just tack on extra credit to if you didn't do well on the midterm, which you'll learn soon. Thursday you'll all learn whether you did well or not. And in general, the midterm I've graded about 10 of them so far. I'm only about a quarter of the way through the class, but in general, the ones that I've graded exhibit some of the hallmarks that I've come to expect from a first midterm. And those hallmarks, primarily, defects of those hallmarks, the defective hallmarks primarily include just insufficient explanation and description of the philosophical material that we've been going through. Insufficient philosophical depth, right? Too much of a just, here's the practical answer, and that's what these guys say, and because these guys follow this rule, I want everyone to start thinking about the justification for the rule, okay? So some of you, might have been been getting 16 or 17 on your reading summary points, and all of a sudden now you're getting like an 85 or an 86 out of 100, a little bit lower than what you expect. But it's only worth 20% of your grade, and I'm sure you'll figure it out by the time you get to the final exam. But just bear in mind that those grades can't be changed, your midterm exam and your final exam. But on the reading summaries, you can buttress your point total by either collecting garbage or now by this other thing. But I just would like to see what students can come up with. Use colors, be creative. And I'll say, okay, the more if you do this, you'll get anywhere. Did I say 5 earlier? I'll say 4. All right, anywhere between 4 and 8 points extra credit. Let's say 4 and 10. If somebody comes up with a really cool one that's just all kinds of colors in it, and the colors have to be not, they have to mean something, right? Though their colors have to have some significance. You can't just make it all rainbow colored and say, wow, that's great. Anyway, all right, enough of this. So what is the traditional account of the type of moral status that we in Western cultures have come to associate with rights language? That's a big deal. Having rights is a really big deal that many people don't realize. But Kant gives us this traditional deontological account of moral rights. You might wonder about this word deontology. And it comes from the Greek word deon, which just means duty. So, deontology is literally translated as the study of duty. Okay, and so Kant surveys the moral universe or the physical universe, and he determines that only humans. He may be totally wrong about this because we don't really know, but he notices that humans have this extraordinary power of rationality. And he notices that power of rationality gives us a degree of freedom, a degree of control of choice, of autonomy, being captains of our own ship, right? That other animals don't have. For a traditional deontological count, there are no real gradations between different kinds of moral status. You either have moral status or you don't, right? If you have moral status, that means you have rights, okay? And if you're morally considerable, that means you have moral rights, okay? On a traditional view, which is strictly anthropocentric. Okay? Non-human animals are not rational. They're not autonomous because they're not rational. Think about rationality. Maybe one threshold requirement to be considered sufficiently rational and autonomous to be a bearer of rights would be whether or not you can make and keep promises, okay? So think about that. Maybe in 20 years you'll remember that philosophy professor you had. And it never occurred to you how important that characteristic is. Anyway, that's special, isn't it? The ability to make and keep promises. What other kinds of animals can do that? Is it just a so human-centered a question already that it's unfair? Make and keep promises. We certainly can't confirm it. I suspect that Roy, my dog, makes and keeps promises to me all the time. So, perhaps a dolphin trainer, someone who really knows dolphins really well will instruct you likewise. Yeah, dolphins are making promises to me all the time because they could jump and just squash me, right? Or they could bite me. They never do. And they seem to have a lot of respect for me, and I have respect for them, and they know that I have respect for them. Anyway, but Kant thinks that only humans are capable, right? In order to make a promise, you have to have enough of an understanding about yourself, right? You have to have confidence in the stability of your character to make a promise, right? And you have to know that you have power over the event that you have to have power over the chain of events in order for you to keep your promise, right? To make a promise, you have to anticipate being able to keep the promise, right? And that's where your rationality is so important, right? No other animals seem to be capable of foreseeing the future enough to be able to understand that, yeah, if I say that I'm going to do this, then I can certainly do this, and I can keep that promise, right? Anyway, only human animals are rational, autonomous. Only human animals can make promises, and so therefore only humans, animals are morally considerable. Only human animals have moral rights, and everything else is just property, okay? Now, con, if people for the ethical treatment of animals or some, animal rights organization was to rank, I think this would be a good project for them actually, to rank all the thinkers in the world, as many prominent thinkers as you can think of, as you can come up with, and put them on a list and give them like, 1 to 10 rating in terms of their respect for non-human animals. Kant actually would get a very high rating. He would get a very high score. But he thought it was very important to be kind and not to be cruel to animals, only because it reflected badly on the person who might be doing that. Okay? So we erode our own humanity when we abuse an animal, or when we fail to give an animal the respect that we know the animal should get. Right? But it's not that the animal is the animal itself has no moral status, okay? Because the animal is not rational or autonomous. All right, so let's take our 5-minute break, and then we'll continue along this. All right? So come back right at the top of the hour.
stuff to say. Because I remember that, I think it's instructions that you weren't supposed to like, feel like softball causes. You pretend like accident. So you can call it reference. Before we begin, we're supposed to
All right, so how is everyone? Did you have a nice break? Yes? I never asked that beforehand. All right. So I erased it. We don't need this half of the wheel anymore at all, at least until later in the term. But I've got some other bizarre little diagram up here. You know, it's so simplistic. You know, I don't know if it helps at all. But these arrows are supposed to be right. I've written up here suprasensory order, or you could call it the numinal order, the order of knowledge. All right. And what I observe in my email to myself, or as a note to myself, the hallmark of neo-Kantian reasoning, moral reasoning, is postulation of a suprasensory order, an order of knowledge, of noumena, that includes both empirical and normative elements. That's a big part of Kantian moral reasoning, is that the relationships that pertain, of course, with Kantian moral reasoning, we don't care about any of these other entities. Right? We just have two or more humans. I mean, we care about them, but why we care about them is a reflection of us, not a reflection of their moral status. All right? But let's draw a few different humans up here. I should have made them different colors, but I guess I should keep all the entities the same color. I don't know. So for Kant, studying the empirical dimensions of our relationships among one another are paralleled by these moral obligations, there are moral dimensions to our relationships to one another. And Kant summarizes this moral dimension to our relationships with each other in his famous formula of humanity, okay? Which says that, which instructs us to treat the humanity in ourselves. Let's say this is me, and then this is you and you, right? Instructs us to treat the humanity in oneself and in others always as an end and never solely as a means. Okay, that is the formula of humanity. Treat the humanity in oneself and in others always as an end and never solely as a means. Okay? And the hallmark of a morally wrong action is an action that in some sense completely reduces another human being to the status of an instrument for my own ends. Okay? That's the hallmark of a morally wrong act. Okay, so Kant thinks that he now has explained why many things that we intuitively, perhaps we could use that word intuitively, or perhaps what a lot of religious teachings teach us are morally wrong, we can now confirm. Without reference to just intuitions or religion or doctrine or something like that, we can now confirm, wow, why they're morally wrong. They're morally wrong because they involve reduction of the human being to instrumental status. Total reduction. Okay? So the hallmark, so for a murder, obviously, would be the ultimate, you know, that's total reduction, right? To take a life. Involves the total reduction of that person for some specific goal, right? In the instance of our friend Kevin, who got picked on, and is going to be our example for the rest of the term, sadly enough. It won't come up again too much. But Kant would have a perfectly reasonable explanation for why it would be morally wrong to harvest Kevin's life. Because remember, Kevin has this extraordinarily valuable, medically valuable, medicinally valuable genetic material. Right? We have a very advanced genetic science nowadays and it's already been determined that if we have to harvest all of his genetic material. So basically, it's a lot more complicated than this, but what they do basically is they euthanize Kevin, and they grind up his body, and they put it in one of those centrifuges and spin it around and put all kinds of fancy lights on it, and they extract enough serum, right? Then they end up with a product, a serum that can treat 1,000 people who have a range of different illnesses, right? So, being the good utilitarians that they are, our legislators, our congressmen and our state legislators in Salem, both agreed that we ought to adopt this new law that says if it has been determined, scientifically determined, that one human's genetic material can be used to save at least 999 humans, right? Then we ought to authorize that. Okay, so pretty soon you'll hear the sirens. They're going to be coming for him. Right? Again, we would want that, right? Wouldn't we? I mean, it's for our good. It's for our benefit. Some of the people who are going to benefit from this genetic material are right here. More than one of you are here in this class. So it makes perfect sense, right? Well, what does Kant say? How does Kant then turn around and say, no, morally wrong. Totally morally wrong. Why? Why is what we are contemplating doing with our community member, Kevin, morally wrong on a Kantian perspective? You're reducing him to an instrument. It doesn't matter what the reasons, what the end of your instrumentalization of Kevin is. It doesn't matter at all. It could save 1 million people. It's going to be morally wrong. Because that's the test of whether or not something is morally wrong. Okay? All right? So, now when we start to expand our deontological analysis and as our deontologists begin to become ecologically literate, scientifically informed about the necessary relationships, the necessary physical, empirical, scientifically confirmable relationships that adhere between, for example, wolves and deer. You like my little symbols here? My little, right? These are my pictographs. Anyway, here's a wolf, right? They'll be debating about it, the archaeologists, for millions of years, right? That looks like a thylacine. No. Anyway, who cares? All right, and then the deer, okay, see his cute little antlers? And then the salmon, all right? And if we're ecologically informed, we know, like Uncle Aldo, right? Uncle Aldo knew that there were these necessary relationships that adhered, right? Of course, we got to have arrows all over the place, right? I mean, there are necessary relationships between us and Leopold. The genius of Leopold, his great contribution, is recognizing that the physical aspects of these relationships that adhere among different elements of the biotic community also have moral dimensions to them. Okay? And so just as Kant says, we have moral obligations to one another in virtue of our mutual humanity, a neo-Kantian ecocentrist says we have moral obligations to deer herds, to wolf packs, to salmon populations, to forests, right? We have moral obligations in virtue of what ecology discloses about the connections between what we do, right? And of course, there's another, right? Whoopee, forgot about those ones too, huh? That's supposed to be the climate, okay? That's Earth's climate systems. Earth's many climate systems, probably there are many. Very, very complex science, I guess, but anyway, there are, and so the more greenhouse gases we emit, right? We know that's one of the necessary. That's the law that can't be changed, right? You can't change these physical laws. Sorry. You want to, right? Like the delusional TED Talk speaker. He wants to change the physical laws, right? And bring back this bird. His heart is just deeply in anguish over the loss of this bird. But he's delusional because you need to restore the whole. Otherwise you can't, right? A passenger pigeon is 95% place and only 5% bones and blood and feathers, right? It's part of an ecosystem. That's what gives it its life. You can't just invent something like God and just throw it out there, right? Anyway, once we understand, right? Once we are informed by climate science, because we turned off the right-wing corporate media machine, and we started just paying attention to the people whose work is peer-reviewed, who are serious, and not just trying to pull the wool over your eyes because their overlords might lose some money in the future, right? If we're serious about understanding the relationship between human activity and the climate, then we realize that we are morally bound to not do certain things, like continue to emit all these greenhouse gases, right? So the physical relationship between humans and the climate also has moral dimensions to it. That's what the neo-Kantians are saying, and that's why they can be non-consequentialists, right? Because the moral quality of an act lies not in consequences for human beings, or for anything really per se, but just in whether or not these hard and fast moral obligations are being respected and observed, okay? All right, so it's a non-consequentialist ethic, and the sturdiest, probably, the sturdiest ethic we've encountered so far. Sturdiest in the sense that it's not buffeted about by culture, right? Collicutt's theory of the moral status of an ecological whole is dependent on culture, right? So if it's buffeted about, it's going to be relativistic, right? Whereas Kant and the neo-Kantians' account of the moral status of an ecological whole appears that if you're willing to make this, perhaps you made some serious wrecks, suprasensory, come on, man. A noumenal realm, those are some questionable metaphysical commitments, perhaps. But if you're willing to make them, then you've got yourself a pretty sturdy ethic. You guys see that? I do want to have more participation in this class, too. It's always hard and more hard in the philosophy class, right? If we were just talking ecology, anyway, but we will end up having a lot more discussion in this class, and I want you guys to start trying to think about contributions philosophically to our discussion, because I can't just keep running the whole show up here. But I do want to get to a point, which is why I've been running the show so far. I do want to get to a point where we're more familiar with the terms of the discussion, and where we're careful not to just have a discussion degenerate into some consequentialist, we should not build